Hello, this is the configuration that we are going to look at in the bypass mode. Mm, Just to encourage you, just to make you happy, the bypass configuration is almost the same as the inline deployment, except for slight changes that we do on the switch. It's additional configuration that we have to do on the switch and on the firewall so that they can exchange traffic with each other. So we implement the configuration or do that additional configuration on these two devices. However, the actual authentication related configuration remains exactly the same on both the firewall and the agile controller. And then within the same video, towards the end, we'll take a brief look at the troubleshooting that we can do on the firewall and on the agile controller. This is the typical scenario for bypass mode, where the firewall is not sitting in line with the traffic and is connected through the switch. So the additional task here is that the traffic coming to the switch should be forwarded to the firewall, and the firewall should be able to send that traffic back to the switch, and then the traffic will go to the data center or the internet. The configuration steps are once again very similar. Basic configuration, we do the configuration on the switch and the firewall for traffic diversion, and then we do the SACG related configuration on the firewall and the agile controller. The basic configuration remains the same, as you can see, and then we do the configuration on the switch. On the switch, we configure an access list to define which traffic should be forwarded to the firewall. So in the access list, we define the traffic from this subnet is going to be forwarded to the firewall, and then we redirect this traffic matching the ACL 3000 to the next hop IP address, which is the firewall IP address. This means that the switch is going to forward traffic from this subnet coming into this interface towards the firewall. Similarly, we go to the firewall and then we configure a static route, in this case a static default route on the firewall, so that the firewall can forward all the traffic to this next hop IP address, which is the IP address of the switch. So the firewall is going to send the traffic back to the switch. After this is done, rest of the configuration is exactly the same which we did on the firewall and the agile controller for the inline mode. In the bypass mode, we do the exact same configuration without any changes. So it will be fairly simple for you to follow it this time. On the firewall, we identify the agile controller servers and the location of the web page which needs to be pushed to the clients who do not have any Office installed. Then we allow the traffic, post-authentication traffic, to move from the untrust zone to the trust zone. We need to apply a policy or configure a policy on the firewall. Then we move to the agile controller. We configure the firewall, tell the agile controller about the firewall so that the agile controller can communicate with the firewall. Define the range of addresses which need authentication. Then we follow the series of steps. First, we do the configuration or add resources to the pre-authentication domain, our DNS server in this case. After adding resources to the pre-authentication domain, then we add resources to the controlled domain. Into the controlled domain, we add two types of resources. We add the isolation domain resources, which are the antivirus and the patch server here. And this is the service system or email gateway for email server, for example, your Exchange server or your ERP or SharePoint server. So this is your post-authentication server which we need to add to the control domain. In the next step, we move to adding resources, defining action in the post-authentication domain. We add the isolation domain, or from the previous step, the two types of resources we added to the control domain. We add those resources here, and either we permit access to those resources or we prohibit access to those resources. And these two actions or these two post-authentication domain resources will be used in the next slide, where we are going to create a SACG policy group. But before that, we create a schedule. Weekdays only 8 to 5:30. Then we combine all this in the SACG policy. In the SACG policy, we allow access during the working time, and we disallow or prohibit access during the weekends and during the after hours. And finally, we apply this policy, SACG policy. We apply this policy when we do next stage. We can apply this policy to the user group guest, and now the guests will be able to access the resources according to this policy and according to the schedule and the resources defined in the previous slides. We can once again verify this configuration on the firewall. Firewall should be connected to the Agile controller. We can look at the online users either on the firewall or on the Agile controller. Once this is done, our configuration, basic configuration for SACG authentication in the bypass mode is complete. Now you know about how to configure the SACG authentication in inline as well as in the bypass mode. Let's take a brief look on the troubleshooting. Troubleshooting is fairly simple. If you've followed the steps along the troubleshooting, or there should not be any issue. It should be fairly smooth. Just look at the steps, just follow this slide. I'm not going to look at each and every step, but just to give you an idea of what could be the typical problems, just make sure if there is any issue, if the users are not being authenticated, just make sure that your firewall is connected to the Agile controller. As you've seen in the verification, you should check whether your firewall is connected to the Agile controller or not. If not, obviously there could be a connectivity problem between the two, or there could be shared key problem, or there could be any other issue which you need to resolve. Once that is done, it is connected, then make sure that you follow all the steps the way that we discussed in this video and the way you'll find in the documentation, that you follow the steps. And I'll just in a couple of sentences repeat those steps. That on the Agile controller, you need to be connected to the firewall. On the firewall, you need to be connected to the Agile controller. Then on the Agile controller, we need to define resources in the pre-authentication domain. We need to define resources in the controlled domain. We need to define actions in the post-authentication domain and call the resources which we defined in the control domain. Then we define a schedule. Then if we want to implement schedule-based control, we need to define a schedule, and then we define the SACG policy, and then finally we map the policy or apply the policy to a user group or to IP addresses or to any resources. Once this is done, this means that everything is in place. This means the operation should be smooth and the user should be able to get authenticated using the SACG authentication method. I hope you enjoyed the video. You have a good understanding of SACG. Thanks for watching the video, and see you in the next video.